Donald Trump just appointed JD Vance as his vice presidential running mate. And with how this election is going, Vance is probably our next vice president. The office of vice president has changed a lot since our founding. So we're going to dive into its history with constitutional crises, stark rivalries, multiple amendments, assassinations, and the singular Dick Cheney. The vice presidency takes several paths depending on the person and the situation. Watch to the end and we'll take an educated guess on which path JD Vance is going to take. Then, as always, we'll propose a solution to improve the system. Let's go. My name is Matt Latimer, and this is Imagine Better. To explore the importance of Donald Trump choosing JD Vance as his vice presidential running mate, we need to know its weird history and the cast of characters to inhabit that office before. Let's start with the Constitutional Convention, the birthplace of the vice presidency. The Constitutional Convention ran from May 25th to September 17th in 1787. In the last few weeks, the convention still disagreed on the few pieces they had left. They had yet to even consider the vice presidency at this point. The convention then created the Committee on Postponed Parts on August 31st to address these problems. 3 of these postponed parts were the Electoral College, the President of the Senate, and presidential succession. With the Electoral College, the committee wanted to prevent electors from just voting for someone from their home state. That scenario would never produce a majority and would throw the election to the House every time. The vice president was that solution. They created a system where the electors would vote for 2 candidates. One could be your favorite in-state candidate, but one would have to be from out of state. Then, the top 2 vote getters would be president and vice president. The vice presidency also presented a solution to the president of the Senate issue by just assigning that role to the vice president and allowing the vice president to vote in the Senate in case of a tie. Then naturally they decided to solve the issue of presidential succession by putting the vice president in that role as well. So even though the vice presidency was an afterthought, it had hard power in the Senate and it had soft power from being the second largest vote getter in the country. So, with the background set, let's get into the history of some actual vice presidents. John Adams is the first vice president and is in a pretty unique spot. Everyone knew who the president was going to be, but not the vice president. Everyone's first votes went to Washington, who received 69 votes. The second vote was the actual competition. John Adams received second place with 34 votes. The electors respected him and saw him as a geographical balance to George Washington. Adams essentially set the precedent for how the vice president was supposed to act. Washington did not involve him in the executive branch, setting the longest precedent. Adams tried to cut out a legislative role for himself in the Senate, but largely made a fool of himself in his first big fight. He tried to champion a law to call the president Highness, but really just earned the nickname His Rotundity. Just half a year into his presidency, he commented, "My country, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Adams played less and less of a role as vice president as time went on, but he did end up casting 29 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. That record would stand for over 30 years in the Senate and only be broken twice. Our next vice president was Thomas Jefferson, who ran against Adams for the presidency. Jefferson wholly opposed Adams and everything he stood for. He backed away from involving himself in the Senate, transitioning to more of a parliamentarian role. Then he used his title to run against Adams for the next 4 years. In 1800, Jefferson challenged him once more. As parties grew more powerful, they officially nominated candidates as president and vice president in their congressional nominating caucuses. The Federalists understood that they needed one elector to vote against their own vice presidential candidate, thus giving Charles Pinckney one less vote than Adams. The Democratic Republicans did not. Jefferson and his vice presidential nominee Burr both received 73 votes from the same 73 electors. The tie threw the election to the House. Instead of conceding the presidency to Jefferson as they agreed, Burr plotted to earn more Federalist votes and take the presidency from Jefferson. Hamilton rallied behind Jefferson to prevent this, but the damage was done. Jefferson no longer trusted Burr and locked him out of his administration. While Burr presided over the Senate and the nation's first impeachment trial with grace, he never had influence with the executive branch. Burr's betrayal led to Jefferson championing the 12th Amendment. Congress passed and the states ratified the 12th Amendment by the next election, which changed the Electoral College in 2 ways. The significant change for our purposes is that electors would cast one vote for president and one vote for vice president. Now, we don't have the time to examine the biography of every vice presidential candidate, but what we can do is examine some characteristics now that we have the idea of the stable vice presidency. The first thing we'll look at is whether the vice presidential nominee was the choice of the presidential nominee. The second thing we'll look at is the reason why the vice presidential candidate was picked. Was it geographical balance, ideological balance, age balance, experience balance, or as a governing partner? Finally, we'll examine whether that vice president had any significant role in the administration or the Senate. Okay, we'll speed through a lot of these, but trust me, we'll stop at the important points. George Clinton served under both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and was one of two vice presidents to serve under two presidents. Unfortunately, he died in office. That spot remained vacant, as there was no way to appoint a vice president before the 25th Amendment. Eldridge Gerry of gerrymander fame served as James Madison's second vice president and died in office as well. Daniel Tompkins was James Monroe's vice president, fell into alcoholism, and spent most of his time away from D.C. The election of 1804 fell into a nonpartisan race as the Federalist Party fell apart and the Democratic Republicans refused to adhere to congressional nominating caucuses, effectively ending that practice. John C. Calhoun was the second VP to serve two presidents, but opposed one and alienated the other. Calhoun was the first VP of the Democratic Party and the first VP chosen by a national convention. Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's second VP and served as his close advisor and, uniquely to this time, his chosen successor. Richard Minter Johnson served as VP under Van Buren. As Jackson's preferred candidate, he beat out Van Buren's pick. Also, because of 23 faithless electors who voted for Van Buren but not for Johnson, Johnson became the only vice president to have ever been elected by the Senate. He was such a corrupt vice president that the Democratic National Convention refused to nominate any VP at their next convention. John Tyler served as William Henry Harrison's VP. The Whigs held their first convention, and these were their first nominees. John Tyler did not even plan to be in D.C. as vice president. But that all changed when Harrison died a month into his presidency. The cabinet, however, interpreted the Constitution differently. The 12th Amendment states, in case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. The cabinet decided that that meant that Tyler would only be the acting president, not the president. Tyler disagreed, having himself sworn in as president, moving into the White House, and assuming the full role as president. The cabinet did not challenge him. The House and the Senate then passed resolutions asserting that Tyler was in fact the president. George Dallas served as James K. Polk's VP. Even though Polk did not choose him, he was the second choice of the convention, and he wasn't even present to be nominated. He was one of the most effective vice presidents in early U.S. history. Millard Fillmore served as Zachary Taylor's VP. Despite being offered a larger role as vice president by Zachary Taylor, he never received one. However, he did assume the presidency upon Taylor's death. William King served as Franklin Pierce's VP to represent the Buchanan side of the party. He was so sick that he actually ended up dying before performing a single act as vice president. John Breckinridge served as James Buchanan's VP to represent Pierce's wing of the Democratic Party. In 1856, the Whig Party split into two parties, the anti-immigrant Southern-based Know-Nothing Party and the anti-slave Northern-based Republican Party. Hannibal Hamlin served as Abraham Lincoln's VP to balance out his moderation with a radical Republican. In 1864, Lincoln formed the National Unity Party to unite the country. He used his influence to push the convention to nominate the pro-Union Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson. Unfortunately, we all know the circumstances under which Johnson assumed the presidency. Schuyler Colfax served as Ulysses S. Grant's VP to once again balance Grant's moderate views with a radical Republican. After Colfax tried to run against Grant for the presidential nomination, Henry Wilson served as Grant's next VP in order to get anti-Grant Republicans to not form a third party. William Wheeler served as Rutherford B. Hayes's VP, even though Hayes had never heard of him at the time of nomination. Chester Arthur served as James Garfield's VP and assumed the presidency when he was assassinated. Thomas Hendricks served as Grover Cleveland's VP, but was so sick that he died in office. Levi Morton served as Benjamin Harrison's VP, and despite all their differences, Morton actually played a very active role in the Senate. Adlai Stevenson served as Grover Cleveland's second VP in order to win the state of Illinois. William McKinley and Garrett Hobart won their respective nominations on the first ballot. Hobart was there to be McKinley's governing partner and bring New Jersey into play. And he was a great governing partner. Hobart was such a close advisor and was so effective at pushing McKinley's agenda through the Senate that he earned the nickname Assistant President, joining the ranks of Van Buren and George Dallas as the few effective vice presidents. Unfortunately, he fell ill and died in office. Theodore Roosevelt served as McKinley's second VP because his political enemies back in New York nominated him for vice president in an effort to get him to not run for New York governor again. He assumed the presidency when McKinley was assassinated in the first year of his second term. Charles Fairbanks served as Theodore Roosevelt's VP as an ideological opponent of Roosevelt's. James Sherman served as William Taft's vice president and was the only sitting vice president to win renomination since Calhoun. Thomas Marshall served as Woodrow Wilson's VP because of convention deal-making. Wilson traded support for the VP nomination and access to cabinet meetings in return for Marshall's delegates for the presidential nomination. This one deal changed the vice presidency forever. The vice president was now firmly in the executive branch. Because Marshall disagreed vehemently with Wilson on policy, and the president ignored most of his council and cabinet meetings, Marshall eventually stopped going. However, Marshall mastered the Senate and even created the rule that a 2/3 vote could stop a filibuster. Wilson had a stroke in his second term, setting off a succession crisis. Despite several political figures urging Marshall to seize the presidency, Marshall allowed Wilson to serve out the rest of his term, fearing a constitutional crisis. Calvin Coolidge served as vice president under William Harding and continued to attend cabinet meetings, solidifying it into a tradition. He assumed the presidency when Harding died from a heart attack. Charles Dawes served as Calvin Coolidge's VP after Coolidge's first two choices declined. Dawes quickly lost favor with Coolidge after several public failures, so he stopped attending cabinet meetings. Charles Curtis served as Herbert Hoover's VP and was the leader of the anti-Hoover wing of the party. John Nance Garner served as Franklin D. Roosevelt's VP. He continued the tradition of attending cabinet meetings and was thoroughly involved in the administration and Congress. Garner was also the first vice president to be sworn in with the president. That said, he was never able to meaningfully alter the president's policies. He famously referred to the vice presidency as not being worth a warm bucket of piss. Henry Wallace served as FDR's VP after Garner decided to run for president. Wallace was handpicked by FDR due to his loyalty and served on boards dealing with economic warfare and war mobilization. He was even the president's liaison to the Manhattan Project. Wallace truly served as a second-in-command to FDR to the extent that the press gave him the same nickname as Garrett Hobart, Assistant President. Harry Truman served as FDR's third VP when FDR showed no preference for keeping Wallace at the convention. The party knew that they were most likely selecting the next president as FDR's health was declining rapidly. Despite that, Truman served little role as vice president. Alben Barkley served as Harry Truman's vice president, and they both completed the transformation of the vice presidential office from a legislative one to an executive one. Truman didn't want any vice president to be left in the dark like he was. He wanted the vice president to serve an active role and have situational awareness in the administration. When Truman created the National Security Council, he included a spot for the vice president. Barkley also chaired the Senate Democratic Policy Committee and acted as the primary spokesman for the administration. He absolutely changed the vice presidency. Richard Nixon served as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. Eisenhower accepted the increased role of the vice president and gave Nixon even more. Nixon ran cabinet meetings in Eisenhower's absence and even went on foreign assignments. During two periods when Eisenhower had health problems, Nixon assumed the presidential roles, but did not try to kick Eisenhower out. Lyndon B. Johnson served as John F. Kennedy's VP, even though Kennedy had an open disdain for LBJ. Johnson tried seizing several new powers for the VP to no avail. He tried seizing the power of the Senate Majority Leader, controlling all national security policy, and even taking the office right next to the Oval Office as his own. He was able to secure an office in the old executive office building, though. All of these failed, but LBJ did assume the role of presidency after JFK's assassination. Herbert Humphrey served as LBJ's VP as Congress passed and the states ratified the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment clears up several questions when it comes to the vice president. It clarifies that the VP does become president upon a vacancy in that office. It creates the power to appoint a vice president upon a vacancy in that office. And it provides a method for the VP to take over the acting role of president should the president become unfit to fulfill that role. Spiro Agnew served as Richard Nixon's vice president, and despite statements to the contrary and having an office in the West Wing for the first year, did not expand the role of the vice presidency. He resigned after accepting a plea bargain from corruption charges from when he was governor of New York. Gerald Ford served as Richard Nixon's VP and was the first appointed vice president in U.S. history. He then assumed the presidency after Nixon's resignation. Nelson Rockefeller served as Gerald Ford's vice president and was the second appointed vice president in U.S. history. Ford chose Rockefeller for an ideological balance and to access his money in a re-election bid. The vice presidential residence was created under his term, although he never inhabited it as his primary residence. Walter Mondale served as Jimmy Carter's vice president. He was the first vice president picked directly by the presidential nominee in the new primary process, the first to have an office in the West Wing, and held a significant role as an activist vice president. George H.W. Bush served as Ronald Reagan's VP and focused on developing a relationship with Reagan rather than pushing for his preferred policy agenda or extending the powers of the office. Dan Quayle served as George H.W. Bush's VP and didn't take a particularly large role in the administration. Al Gore served as Bill Clinton's VP despite no obvious electoral advantages. Dick Cheney served as George W. Bush's VP even though he had to switch his state of residency from Texas to Wyoming to be able to qualify. Dick Cheney is believed to be the most powerful vice president in history, but nothing is confirmed due to all the secrecy around his role. There are rumors of his influence in every corner of the Bush administration's policy, and even that he had unilateral decision-making power in some areas. Despite the ambiguity, both McCain and Obama promised that their VPs would not have as large a role. Joe Biden served as Barack Obama's VP and drastically reduced the role from the Cheney administration. Mike Pence served as Donald Trump's VP and significantly influenced both cabinet appointments and some foreign policy decisions. Kamala Harris served as Joe Biden's VP because of the Congressional Black Caucus's instrumental role in winning Biden the nomination. Clyburn called for Biden to choose a black woman as a running mate because, quote, African American women needed to be rewarded for their loyalty. Kamala Harris has had the smallest role as VP since Dan Quayle. And now we've reached today and JD Vance's nomination as vice president. So why did Trump pick JD Vance as his running mate? The first theory is that JD Vance provides ideological balance because JD Vance was once a never-Trumper. This strategy would be in the mold of JFK picking LBJ to win over Southern Democrats. The problem with this theory is that JD Vance turned away from those comments more than 8 years ago and has never turned back. He has also consistently occupied the same ideological space as Donald Trump, even when he personally disagreed with him. The second theory is to create a vacancy in the Senate for the governor of Ohio to appoint Vivek Ramaswamy. That strategy would be more in the mold of Theodore Roosevelt's nomination. This theory seems a little far-fetched as Trump could easily appoint Vivek Ramaswamy to a cabinet position to get him political experience. The third theory is electoral balance. This would be more in the mold of a Thomas Hendricks nomination. This theory is the craziest, as Ohio is nowhere near a swing state, and Trump even performs better there than Vance. The fourth theory is age balance. This strategy would be in the mold of someone like Dan Quayle. This theory is probably partly true with how much this race has become about age, but it's not the main reason. The fifth theory is a governance partner and a possible successor. This strategy is very rare, and between Martin Van Buren and Al Gore, this strategy has only happened a few times. Yet, this is the theory that seems to ring true. With the election looking like it might be the biggest landslide this century, and Trump limited to only one term, he has the freedom and ability to choose someone to govern, not just to win. So how do we encourage more VP picks that are picked for their governing ability? The ability for presidents to directly pick their running mate since the primary reforms of the 70s has helped this a lot, increasing trust and compatibility. We could even go another step, allowing the president to appoint a VP after the election. This change would require a constitutional amendment, but could definitely improve the quality of vice presidents. Just like picking a cabinet, the president could pick someone for their skill in policy or executive functions, rather than their popularity. So what do you think? Is a constitutional amendment too far? Let me know in the comments. If you made it to the end, thank you so much, and here's how you can help us. First, you can click the like button and the subscription and notification buttons if you're on YouTube. Then you can go into the show notes of this video and follow Imagine Better Media on all the social media platforms that you use regularly. After that, please share us with as many people as possible, both online and in person. Finally, you can go to imaginebettermedia.com and sign up for one of our subscriptions. Thank you to our VIP subscribers who help make these videos possible. Let's imagine better and make it happen. And while you're here, you can click here to check out our other stories.